My name is Lise Brekmoe and I grew up in this region. I'm 36 years old and, well, trained as an archeologist and historian. For the last 10 years I've been moving between Norway and Wales, where I've also been training and working as an archeologist, and I now run my own company based on culture and the history of the region. It's named Brekmoe after my own surname, because actually it's a unique surname. Every single one who's called that in Norway is related to me, and it comes with its own sort of heritage and long history of personalities. And I've basically taken that on board, history and ancestry, and I work with cultural productions, theatre, music, also trying to use the fact that I've lived both in Norway and Wales and create exchanges of culture between the two countries, because obviously we've got Meänkieli, Kvensk and Sami, and they've got the Welsh language, which is also a minority language, but that's seen a revitalisation over the last sort of 30 years. And they've achieved lots more than we've done up here with their minority language. So the hope is that my business will also eventually be able to develop a network that goes between those two countries, that we can learn, or basically 4 countries, I suppose, where we can learn from each other in how to present our culture and languages. Our history in the North and North Clot is very much based on the fact that we didn't have borders between our countries for a very long time, not until sort of middle of the 18th century that the borders were drawn. And they run across the ways we've moved through our history. We've always, since beginning of time, when you first start seeing cultural identity in the archaeology, there seems to be very clear links between East and West in this region. And then obviously you get states and you get kingdoms and all these things. And what happened then is that the national borders were drawn across our ways of movement from east to west. All of a sudden, our attention was forced to the south and to realities which were very different to what people up here knew. I don't think there was much understanding back then about who we were up here. And you see in the first written sources, for instance, you see that we're all sort of mythical creatures in the sea. They don't understand us. It's the Sami that are kind of wild people. And I think that's definitely that's shaped us who we are today. I don't think we can kind of shake that history and that heritage off us. And I think Wales has been, to some extent, through the same process, but in a much longer perspective of time than here. Because they were, with the Saxon invasion and the various invasions of Britain, Wales held their fourth. And you've got the border between England and Wales, where you see hill forts today and you see later Norman castles, was the border between a big culture to the east, and then Wales, which hung on to their language and their culture to the east. So in many ways, I think being outsiders for a long time is common. And then in later history, I think we see, certainly in the 20th century, the idea of centralisation, that things are to be gathered. That's affected both our region, obviously. In Norway, we've been fairly lucky compared to Sweden, I think, in that people are still allowed to live in the district and there's lots of government support for it. But we've seen fishing industry not coping. We also share a mining history, which is quite interesting, where Wales obviously has suffered hugely in the last 30 years with the loss of coal mining. And you've got immense social deprivation caused by it. You're now looking at second or third generation of people being unemployed, because what happened in the valleys of South Wales was that you had an increase in population about 70% when the coal mines opened. You created towns, big towns, and then came the 80s and all the coal mines were closed down and people had nowhere to move to. So I think there's a lot of similarities, indeed. Everyone says to me that oh, I always wanted to be an archaeologist when I was a child, as if that's a ridiculous thing to do when you're a grown-up, but which it probably is. But I actually remember very clearly, well, I think history, my dad was always talking about history, so I was probably quite interested, but I remember the exact moment when I thought that my future lies in the past. I was walking with my sister, I must have been about 6 or 7, and I grew up on a farm. And I was walking with my sister and my dad, and we were just rummaging through some of the fields and just climbing it, as you do as a child. You climb up and down trees and do all these things. And all of a sudden, for some reason or other, I noticed this little pile of rocks in a little ditch. And I went over there and started just digging around. And underneath this pile of rocks was a chest. And inside this chest, there were cutlery, and it had a name inscribed in it. There were porcelain, china, nice mugs and a few plates, and there were other little bits and pieces of rusted iron. And this was obviously very exciting. And so we brought it all back to the house and started investigating. And it turned out that this chest had been left by people who were evacuated towards the end of the Second World War. Because obviously Norway was occupied by the Germans. And in November 1944, they realised that they were not able to hold all parts of northern Norway, and they started withdrawing from this region and from Finland. All the troops were passing by here. And first they started saying to people that, encouraging them, you need to leave this area. People obviously didn't want to leave their homes. So in the end, they ended up with a forced evacuation. On a Sunday, I think in the valley here, on the 3rd of November, soldiers were coming out, handing out these notes saying that by this date, this time, you need to be in Sørkjosen by the harbour, and you're going to have to leave your homes. Take everything, take all your belongings with you that you can carry, but the rest of it, just leave it. Leave your animals, your livestock, your horses, leave your houses, pack everything and go. And what a lot of people did then, not knowing what was going on, where they were going, a lot of people hid their belongings because they thought one day we're going to come back. We don't know what the future holds for us, but one day we're going to come back. And they hid their most treasured possessions in places like the ditch that I discovered. And clearly these people never came back, or certainly they might have come back, but by that point they either forgot where they hid it or they never bothered to go and collect these items. Because of what happened, which I don't think anyone imagined what was going to happen in November 1944 when everyone left. There was no information given to people. But the Germans, as they withdrew and moved further south, they started burning down all the buildings. And in Kvænangen, which is just north, I think there was about 12 buildings left standing after the war, after the Germans had left. And people here started coming back, I think, in June 1945, after the end of the war. There were mines everywhere. So the government said to people, stay where you are, because they were sent all over the country. Some people were sent far south, some people were sent outside Tromsø. The border is in Lyngen, where they sort of stopped the evacuation. My grandmother was sent to a place outside Tromsø, I remember. And my granddad was sent even further south. And I think that was kind of the moment when I realised, when I found this, that I wanted to know more about the region's history. And I think that's shaped us as people up here in so many ways that we're not even aware of. Because coming back and there's nothing left. There's a few houses standing, but the majority of the material from your history, your cultural history, has been wiped. You've got nothing. People they turned boats upside down and lived underneath these boats to begin with. The government kept on saying, do not come back, it's dangerous, there's mines everywhere. But people wanted to come back, they didn't care. And they started rebuilding the country. And the government funded partially the rebuilding of the region, but in a very sort of efficient and practical houses that were drawn by an architect. which were meant to be practical and completely different to what people were used to, because before no one told anyone what to build or how things were going to look. They built their own buildings, they found the material themselves, and there was a lot of diversity. And the government offered basically a catalogue of types of buildings, and then you could choose, I want this type of house and this type of barn. So everything that our farms from that point onwards also changed the way they looked. It's changed how we perceive history. It's become a division in time. It's before the war and after the war. And I think I was quite excited when I first came to the UK and you're surrounded by lots of old buildings and castles and everything else. I was really excited because I wasn't used to that. I can count a few buildings I knew that was predating 1945. I suppose that it's quite a difficult story for Finnish people because, you know, it was a different relationship between the Finnish people and the German soldiers. And then you've got Sweden. It's interesting, really, that these three countries experienced the war in such a different way, because you've got Sweden, who's neutral, and then you've got Norway, that was occupied. People now, sadly, who remember the war, have started to pass away. They're old people now. Even those who are old were kids. And it's a very complex notion, I think, because the German soldiers who came here, certainly to the north, were under strict orders to behave as people, you know. So they tried their very best to be polite to the population, and a lot of, when they first arrived, they didn't have barracks, so they settled in houses amongst people. And you're living in this kind of status quo where you're occupied, but you're not really at war, and you're surrounded by all these soldiers. And these tiny villages had so many soldiers arriving. You know, they outnumbered the villages in many, many places. So in some respects, you've got this idea that life just goes on and you have to just get on with it. But at the same time, you witness these awful events. In this village, you had one POW camp, prisoner of war camp, just in Storslett. And interestingly enough, that a lot of people, younger generations, don't even know about this. They had 320 roughly Soviet prisoners who were sat in this camp. People were warned with posters saying that if you have anything to do with the Soviet POWs, we can shoot you, you're going to get arrested. Whilst you've got all these starving people, basically, who's moved here. Most of them were captured in 1941, transported by boats and trains and whatever up here. By the time they arrived here, a lot of them were very ill, and starvation was ripe, tuberculosis, lots of diseases. And they were put to build roads and clear snow. They didn't have any clothing. They were wearing newspapers underneath their clothes. They were still in their uniforms, whatever they had when they were captured. So in this POW camp, we know the names of 52 people who died during the war. The majority of them died within 6 months of arriving here. The youngest one, who died from a heart attack, was 19 years old. So there's a lot of tragedy surrounding that. And people witnessed awful things, like executions and all sorts, and there was no trauma free. You know, you couldn't go to therapy afterwards and talk about what you as an 8-year-old had witnessed. And I think that's sort of, looking at the world around us today, I think that's an incredibly important history to remember, because we should never let anything like that happen again. So you had that camp, and then further up the valley you also had, which was a lot less common, a German POW camp, which I think it's less known. We don't have as much archive material, but those prisoners were probably treated even worse than the Soviet prisoners because they were traitors to Hitler. And a lot of them, they came from the marshes in northern Germany, and a lot of them were political opponents of Hitler, but a lot of them also were gay. And there's surviving interviews with this one bloke who was gay and was arrested, abused and mistreated, something horribly, before they were sent up here. And we don't know how many of those, I think, it was about 2,500 who were sent up to North Norway. And I don't think many of those people survived the war to tell the tale. But those people, they were marked with a big A, pink A, which there's a film made of that. And when they were sat in imprisonment in Germany, they tied their wrists to their ankles and forced them to eat like dogs off the floor. And it's absolutely awful histories. And I think we obviously don't, there's a way of telling these stories, but I think we should be aware of it, because we now send our youngsters with white buses to Auschwitz. And actually all you need to do is go out the door and walk 500 metres up the road, and these horrible things and the traces of how mean and awful people can be to each other just because of religion or sexuality or anything like that is just outside your doorstep. And I think that's an important part of history. Yes, well, I've worked on a number of projects with recording the physical evidence of both POW camps and traces of the occupational forces in terms of coastal fortresses and everything else, because they're such a big part of our history and who we became. And I think we're now ready to start investigating that history. It was very difficult for those who came home and who had lost everything they owned. Just after war, when they came back, a lot of this was blown up, and they tried to kind of remove every trace of the occupation in order to forget and to move on. And I think that's their way of survival, was just to kind of onwards and upwards, really. Let's leave all this behind. But now we're far enough away from it. We didn't experience it. It's for us then really to document this history and decide how do we share this story.